Season 4, Episode 1 of the Actual Fluency podcast with Shannon Kennedy, talking about introverted language learning. Hello everyone and welcome back to the Actual Fluency podcast. I am your host Chris Broholm as usual, and this is the 4th season of the Actual Fluency podcast. You're listening to the first episode and the break is over. I took a few weeks off to recharge, record some new interviews, and take a little break to get back on track. So it's May, which is exciting. The tough months are over and now we're going to enjoy late spring and summer. And I'm here in Budapest. It's a lovely time. All the restaurants and all the cafes have put out the chairs and tables outside and people are having a good time. I see a lot more tourists now than over the winter. Anyway, so what's new? It's a full season, so obviously things change, and the big change that I've done recently is that I've started to invite people to apply to come on the podcast, because I've realized that as a sort of, I guess I'll call myself shy or maybe introverted, which I'll come back to in a minute. It's kind of hard for me to invite people onto the podcast that I don't already know about. So it's hard for me to just invite random people, even though they might have a great story. And I thought, well, why not just let people apply to be on the show if they believe they have something worth sharing? Ideas worth sharing is one of the foundations of this podcast. So if you are sitting out there and have a great language learning story, or maybe you learned a lot of languages, or you learned them quickly, or you learned them in a special way, or basically anything that has anything to do with language learning, if you have a way to tell that in an interesting way that the audience of the podcast would enjoy, well, apply now at actualfluency.com/guest. And this isn't really a formal application, I think I'll probably talk to anyone who fills out the application. It's just a way for me to get a little background info on you before we do the actual interview. So what's on the cards today? Well, I've got Shannon Kennedy from Eurolinguiste. That's probably the best English pronunciation I can give. And she's been blogging over there for a while now, and I've been incredibly impressed with her productivity and the sort of quality of work she's been putting out. And we are talking today about introvertedness and language learning, because for a long time the kind of suggestions in language learning have been about, well, just go out and speak, just talk to people early, you have to speak from day one. And this is mostly come from bloggers such as Benny Lewis. Other people have said it too. And when you're an introvert, it's really hard to just go out and talk to people. And I'm definitely introverted. And I often talk about it on the podcast how if I go down to the subway around the corner, I'm like 50% of the time I order in English, even though I know all the Hungarian words, just because I'm nervous and shy. So talking to Shannon today about that topic was really cool. And also the reason we talked was because she's released a new course and guide on the topic, and in partnership with Benny Lewis. So I found that pretty cool that Benny sort of took the criticism on board that he was catering way too much to extroverted people, or his advice was way too extroverted. So he actually sort of connected with Shannon, who's an introvert and a good writer at that, and they produced this together. So it's released under the Fluent in 3 Months name, but it's actually Shannon who's put most of the work into it. So I'm really excited to present that. And if you're listening to this episode on the 1st of May or on the 2nd of May, there's a deal going on that course where they're selling it for less than half price. Actually, it's a $100 course, which is a very common price point for these kind of things. But if you buy it within the next day or two, not only is it half price, you also get Betty's other course, Conversation Countdown, included. So that's a good deal. If you don't want that, it's $37, which is, I guess, closer to 40% discount. But I mean, not 40%, 60% discount. So that's pretty cool if you want to pick up that. If you are like me, an introvert, and you really struggle with that old advice of just go out and speak, no problem, and it's really difficult. So I really enjoyed recording this week's episode with Shannon. and I hope you enjoy it. Oh, by the way, yeah, if you want to check out that offer, go to actualfluency.com/shy. And that's the offer you can find there. Or you can also find more information about this at actualfluency.com/introvert, where I'll list these different options. But I think it's really cool that Benny kind of went and said, yeah, I can see how introverts might struggle with this. I'll talk to someone and cooperate and getting an actual, a fluent in 3 months product out that kind of addresses this issue. And yeah, so that's pretty cool. And what else is new? Well, back new season and better than ever. I hope so. Thank you so much for listening in to the new season and for listening to all the other episodes. And if you're new to the podcast, well, this is where we motivate and talk about language learning every single week. Well, most of the weeks anyway. Thank you so much for listening in and enjoyed this interview with Shannon Kennedy. All right, we're ready with another episode of the Actual Fluency Podcast, and today I've got Shannon Kennedy on the show. How are you doing today, Shannon?
I'm good, Chris. Thank you so much for having me on.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And today we have tons of exciting topics to talk about. But first, why don't you let the listeners get to know you a little bit better and tell you how you got into language learning and how that became your passion?
Okay. Well, as you said, my name is Shannon, and before all this language learning thing, this whole thing happened for me, I was first and foremost a musician. I am a saxophone player and a vocalist, and that is what I do professionally. So I work in the music industry. The reason that I really got into language, I've always kind of had language in my life, but when I really got into it was actually while I was at university. And as a musicology major, we're required to have a fluent reading ability in German, Italian, French, and Spanish, as well as English. And so I started studying those languages in order to work with primary sources as a part of my research. And then when I went to do my master's degree, I actually did a bunch of field work in France and in Ireland as well. So I really kind of got immersed in language and reading, sources in various languages and things like that. Almost all my research was in French. And I started to realize how much I actually really liked languages. So then I spent all of my free time at school in the language section of the library reading everything that I could. And it was just a passion that stayed with me after university. So that's kind of how I got into it.
Wow, that's really cool. And it reminds me of another musician I had on the show. He was an opera singer, so he also said that they had to do good pronunciation in a few of the Romance languages. So I guess that's a good segue into language learning to get that almost a crash course in all of them, I guess, because I don't suppose they expect you to master the pronunciation in any way, or how does that work?
Well, I didn't actually have to deal with speaking at all except for French because that was my focus.
Oh, okay.
And then Breton as well, actually, but that's a completely different story.
Wow.
But for German, Italian, and Spanish, I didn't have to be able to speak or understand the verbal language. I only had to be able to read. I didn't even have to be able to write. I just had to understand everything that I was reading. So it's a little bit different.
How did you attack that task, though? Just read a lot and use the dictionaries and things like that?
I did a bunch of independent study. I worked with course books and things like that. I had tutors as well prior to actually starting my degree so that I could get a jump start at school. And then when I was enrolled in school, I took supplemental courses in each of the languages, and I did my European framework certifications as well for each of them.
Wow. Was that any tactic behind that, or would you just like to see where you were?
At the end of the course, we were actually required to do the exam. Yeah.
Sounds like a pretty serious course. I guess that's a good thing. Where they had to test it afterwards. So you went how long were you in France for?
I have family in France, so I actually go back all the time. But when I was actually doing my field work, I'd go for a week or two at a time on several occasions.
Okay, so you've had roots or connections to the French language for quite a while then.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And how did you continue after school? I know you've been working a little bit on, or a lot on Mandarin lately. So can you tell us the bridge from going to, I mean, it must be quite different to learn languages when somebody's saying you have to do this, and then suddenly you're just, I want to do this.
Well, I think in school, actually, I mean, I do have experience with someone saying that I have to learn a language because I took languages in school like everyone else, and it really didn't work for me. I was the kid that kind of goofed off in class and didn't pay attention. But when I was around 15, I think for the first time I actually decided like I wanted to learn this specific language. And I had a friend who was actually from the Philippines, but she grew up in Egypt and then she moved. And I met her and she spoke fluent Arabic, and I thought it was so cool and that she spoke another language and one that I didn't know a lot of people who spoke. And so I started taking courses to learn it as well. And it was kind of our secret language for a while. Of course, I've forgotten everything since then, but that was the first time I actually like chose to learn a language. And I think when I started university and I got back into it, that passion and that interest kind of came back. So even though I was doing classes and studying it because I needed to, I really enjoyed the process. So I didn't feel like I was forced to do it. And I actually would even meet with my teachers outside of class and things like that to work on extra things and, just to more fully experience the languages that I was learning. And while I was in the library, at my school, I stumbled across a Croatian course book, and I have a grandfather who is from Croatia, and I had never seen a learning resource for that language before. And so I checked it out, and then the length of time that I was allowed to have it expired. So then I'd go back to the library every single day since I wasn't allowed to check it out again to spend more time with the book while I was there because no one else really had any interest in that language. And I just really fell in love with Croatian. I loved the way that it sounded. And so that, was kind of like my side project in addition to the languages I was learning in school. And I continued doing that when I graduated. That was the language that I stuck with. And so I started to pick up other course books and things like that. But when I left school and I didn't have a teacher kind of telling me what I needed to do anymore, I had no idea what I was supposed to do. So I made the mistake of, going to the local bookstore and just buying everything I could on the languages that I was learning to try and maintain them. So I ended up with a bunch of books that just kind of sat on my shelves and collected dust that were of no use to me. And I don't really remember how I stumbled across the online community, but you were actually one of the first language bloggers that I discovered.
Oh, wow.
And it was your post that you had written on being a lazy language learner. I was like, that sounds so much like me. So, and then through you, I found out about some other bloggers like Benny and things like that. And I started to see some of what they were doing. And I realized I was going about it completely the wrong way. But a lot of the advice that was out there, I didn't really want to do because I'm shy. I'm an introvert. I don't want to go out and speak from day one. I don't want to talk to strangers. I don't want to jump into conversation. I just wanted to stay in my little corner and study and read books on my own and just hope that, I'd start speaking the language, but that I could read, I could understand, I couldn't speak. And so I kind of had to change my approach. And when I started studying Chinese, I began working with a tutor via italki for the first time. And I realized that was working so much better for me than when I just tried to do it all by myself, because you really can't do it by yourself. Language is meant to be used as a tool for communication. And if you're not communicating, you're kind of missing out on a huge, the part of the point of learning a language, other than reading books written originally in a language to enjoy them the way that they were originally conceived, or, film, music, things like that. So,
well, you have a very thick accent. I've heard some people who are just into reading, and you obviously can't blame people for having that interest. But it's funny when they start to speak, they have the most perfect grammar. They know a lot of words, and then they just have the thickest accent of wherever they're from because they never heard the language actually being spoken.
I have to say that when I started speaking, I often felt like my tongue was just this lead weight in my mouth that didn't want it to do what I needed it to do. And as a musician, that's really frustrating because a lot of our training is all on muscle memory. So you train your hands and your mouth and everything so that they're coordinated in movement and in creating what you need to create to produce music. And for language, it was just, that was not the experience that I was having. And I realized that, if I wanted to get good at speaking a language, and if I wanted to do more than just read books or watch movies, if I actually wanted to talk to people, which, ideally I do, that I needed to actually train my speaking muscles, just like I would do for music. So I needed to, kind of overcome my natural tendencies to succeed as a language learner. And so my method started to change a little bit, but, it wasn't until I really became aware of what other language learners were doing and what was working for them without the guidance of a classroom that things really started to take off for me. And I really started to enjoy it because I started to have little successes that, just kind of kept propelling me forward.
Right. And what kind of advantages or benefits did you take from your musician background, if that's even a thing, your experience with the musical arts? What kind of elements did you use when you started learning languages seriously? Were there any pronunciation tips or tricks that you found easier? Like, I know that, for instance, Mandarin is a very, it's tonal, but the pronunciation is very important for understanding. Could you bring anything of that to help you in your language learning?
It's really funny that you asked that question. I wrote an article a while back kind of about a similar topic. And when I first started studying language, to me, music and language were in completely different parts of my head. But when I kept getting asked the question, like, does being a musician help you learn language and stuff like that, I started to really think about it. And I was like, you know what? They're not so isolated. And it's not necessarily like music itself that helps me learn a language. Even as a musician, I do listen to music in other languages, but I wouldn't say that that's something I actively use as a study method. It's just something that I do for pleasure to enjoy the languages that I'm learning. But there are certain things that I did to learn music that I, subconsciously applied to learning languages, similar techniques. One that I do all the time is, when you prepare to go perform, for me as an introvert, that performing, being on stage in front of a bunch of people, I have to do mental preparation in addition to, preparing the music and things like that. And so I kind of use those same techniques before I go into a conversation with someone on Skype or through Hello Talk or whatever. And, some of those techniques help me. And then also, being aware of some of what goes into learning music, like muscle memory and things like that, that knowledge has also helped me when it comes to speaking a language. Being a musician does help with tonal languages because you do hear the change in pitch. You have the training for that. Right. I don't know if I would say it would help me produce them sometimes, but I'm a little bit better at hearing them.
Which is the first problem because, just taking from my Russian experience, when I was learning Russian, I still am, but when I was doing some tutoring, my tutor would correct my pronunciation and she would say, do you not hear the difference between this and this? And I'm like, no, that's the same word. And so half of the problem with pronunciation seems to be that if you can't hear the difference, you can't really produce the difference, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. And I'm with you on Russian. There are some things that I honestly cannot hear the difference. So teachers will say it the way I'm saying it and then say it the way it's supposed to be said. And for the life of me, but that happens when you haven't heard a sound before, it's not familiar to you. You don't hear the difference. And over time you will eventually. But yeah, no, you're right. Like with music, there's all these different methods of practice that you can use. You can use reading where you actually read music, and there's a technique called sight reading, which is where you take something you've never seen before and you read it, which would basically be like taking a text in a foreign language and then reading it for the first time and seeing how much you comprehend without going back to go over things, just do a quick read through without stopping, without taking notes, without, highlighting what you're having an issue with, and just seeing how much of it you understand overall. So that's a technique that works both for language and music. There's just like a lot of different things. And I'm a really firm believer in taking skills that you use to succeed in certain fields and taking a minute to think about how you can apply that to something else that you're doing. So regardless of what you're doing, whether it's music or it's art or it's sports even, the training that goes into doing athletics, if you really think about what you do to succeed in those things, you'll find techniques that you can use to succeed at other things. It may take a little bit of creativity to adapt them to language learning, but when you really look at other things in your life, and when you succeed at one thing and you're good at one thing, that's something that you enjoy doing, whether it's sports or music or whatever, the things that you do to succeed at them, you tend to pick things that work based on your learning, how you learn, and what you enjoy. So why not take those things and apply them to something else? Because then it'll make that something else just as enjoyable for you.
Right, exactly. And it's a very good piece of advice that I hear every now and again. And it can't be said enough that people who are saying, oh, I get bored of reading Harry Potter in Swedish. And I'm like, do you read Harry Potter in English? And they're like, no. I mean, if you're not reading in your native language, why do you think it's going to be enjoyable in a foreign language? That's just going to be torturing yourself, basically. So, I mean, that is just a great advice and something that I've been guilty of, because I don't know if you feel the same, but when you kind of look around for materials to study with, there's so much on the teach yourselves, the colloquials, the assimils, and all these book-based methods. And you just start to think, well, if all these successful polyglots are using these books, they must be good, right? And I think to a degree they are. And textbooks might be a little bit different from actual literary books, but it's no wonder people get stuck in them. Let's put it that way.
Well, just because a resource is good does not mean it's good for you.
Right.
So, I mean, like, I'm a huge fan of Asimil. I love Asimil, but I understand that there's people that it's not going to work for. So, and Pimsleur as well. I know people don't like Pimsleur. They think it's too slow, but I spend so much time in my car commuting to concerts and things like that Pimsleur just works for me because I have to concentrate on driving. I need to be a safe driver. So I can't have something that's really involved or that I'm not going to retain later on. And Pimsleur, it's repetitive. So, I get the right amount of exposure in order to move on to the next lesson. Right. And while I'm only half paying attention.
Pimps Liz is definitely, I would say, an acquired taste. Personally, for me, I've listened to all 30 of the first Russian course, and I must admit, some of the times when I was listening to it, I had to actually walk around, because if I was sitting down on the sofa, I would actually start to doze off. So, I mean, it just goes to show that different tools for different learners, and that's another problem with, well, not a problem, but it's something that if you're just getting into language learning and you're listening to this now, is you have to be inspired by what other people are doing, but there's no such thing as copying other people's method. You have to sort of figure out what works for yourself, and you have to just try everything.
Yeah. And the reviews, they help, because there are methods out there that are just absolutely horrible, that it's not worth, spending time with them. So if someone who's successful at language learning has, support or has, endorsed a product in a way by writing a good review of it, that's usually a decent indication that the resource is worth taking a look at. But what works for everyone has different learning styles, everyone has different interests. So what might work for one person won't necessarily work for you, and you just kind of need to learn what your style of learning is and where your interests fall, and then use those to tailor the methods and resources that you use to study.
Exactly. And before you were just talking about how you changed your method after you started researching the topic. You were learning about learning, as we all do. And can you just give some examples of how you learn languages today compared to back when you were doing it yourself in school?
Okay. Okay. So, for example, with Italian and German, I had a couple of different workbooks that I would just studiously follow along chapter to chapter, page to page, and complete the exercises and read all the little dialogues and introductions and grammar rules and segments. And that was what I did.
Right.
It helped me read because, I was building my vocabulary, and really the only thing you need to be able to read is a basic understanding of how the grammar functions and a pretty significant vocabulary. So that worked for me, but as far as doing anything other than reading, it didn't necessarily work. Mm-hmm. So when I realized that I wanted to do more than just read in the languages that I was learning, I still focused on vocabulary because vocabulary is important. You need to have the words to express what you want to say, even if the grammar is not totally correct. Right. So I definitely lean towards vocabulary over grammar now. So I use Memrise to learn vocabulary, and I also use italki to take lessons. I don't do language exchanges so much. I do them on occasion, but I prefer to work with a tutor because it's someone that I can meet with regularly, get to know, and they tend to offer you criticism in a way that is a little bit more informed, because sometimes when you talk with a native speaker and you do something wrong and you ask them a question like, why is it that way, or something, they can't answer you, and I like to know how things work. So
yeah.
I ask a ton of questions about why, that start with the word why. So I work with tutors, and I occasionally post writing entries on Lang 8. And I also really like Fluent U because it's basically just native language content videos, such as commercials and music videos and things like that they've done interactive subtitles for, and I really like working with those. And then you can take quizzes at the end to test on the vocabulary and grammar that were in those videos. And I also can still work with course books because the course books kind of give you a direction to go in, and they introduce things in phases based on difficulty. So it's kind of like a framework or a guideline for me when I'm working through a language.
Right, and they also often have dialogues which are very useful at various stages. So you can, when you meet people out in the wild, so to speak, you can use some of that instead of, sometimes the vocabulary can be a little bit off. For instance, Pimps Liz, I think, is notorious for having a very travel-oriented vocabulary, which is great if you travel a lot, or if you're like the average American, I think that's what Pimps Liz is made for. And I always made fun of the lessons where it's like, you and your 2 kids are on their way to their hotel room, and where you meet a Russian woman or something, And it's like, it's so far away from a sentence I would ever use. I mean, by the time I would need that sentence, I would have forgotten it. Decades ago. So that can happen too, but I definitely...
Also, they tend to be designed for male speakers. So the responses, especially for Russian and Croatian, which are 2 languages I've done with them, the default response is if you are a male, which I'm not. So I end up I understand that I need to understand what a guy is saying when he says to me, because the words are going to be slightly different, but it's just... For me, it's frustrating a little bit because I'm not a man and I won't say those things.
Yeah, exactly. So, you would never use that sentence, so it's completely irrelevant for you. And the counterpoint, if they added the sentences for the women, then it would be irrelevant for the men. So it's like, either way, you end up with some, surplus vocabulary you can't really use for anything, but...
Right, but you're going to get that from any resource because no resource is perfectly created for you. So there's always going to be things that you don't find useful, and then there's not going to be enough of something that you do find useful. So, all of the different resources that are out there, they're just a starting point. And then you need to take responsibility to kind of go further and find the things that you need to say and understand what you want to say and understand.
Somebody actually proposed a new, I guess you can call it a tool, a new language learning tool. What they told me was I should send them, or maybe it was from my blog or something, but they would basically translate stuff that I'd written in English into the target language I was learning, like Russian, and then they would insert it into flashcards. So I would be learning about my own life and my sentences that I already have used in the target language. So that could be a very interesting avenue to explore in the future. Personalized vocabulary learning, that could be fun. I don't know how that's going to work in practice, but I was just thinking when you said it's never 100% been tailored to you, and one of my friends actually recently proposed the exact idea.
That would be really interesting. Might be hard because when you just pop things into a translator, the accuracy isn't always super great. So it'd probably need to be done by someone who has a good understanding of both the source and target languages. So it could be pricey, but I mean, if that's something that you can't find elsewhere, I would definitely see the value of investing into something like that.
We'll see how far they get with it. I think for now it's just a little idea, but hopefully that might come to fruition. And vocabulary, it's funny, it's been a big, when I started learning languages, I didn't really think the vocabulary would be so important, because I would think, oh, okay, well, if you don't understand the grammar, how can you understand what people are saying just with the words? But now that I'm totally at the other camp, I'm thinking, like, what do you need grammar for? You know, if, for instance, the goalless method is something that I haven't really explored myself, but I talk to some of the people who do it a lot, and they say, you know, if you know all the words of a language, it doesn't matter if you have no idea about the grammar, because of course there'll be times when you won't be understood, particularly perhaps in Slavic languages or complicated languages. But in English, for instance, I mean, Benny made these examples all the time that he would just go Tarzan mode, you know, just me go toilet. Of course, people understand that, but he hasn't got any grammar in there. He just said literally 3 words out of the dictionary. Of course, you should learn some grammar at some point, but I think the argument is fantastic, and I'm also in completely the same boat. And I think that problems in languages, when you speak to people, failure to understand or failure to produce language is almost always a consequence of a missing vocab. It's very rare that a communication breakdown is because you can't remember the conjugation of, I don't know, third person, genitive in males in Russian.
I so agree with you. Whenever I've found that I've gotten stuck in a language, it's just because I didn't know the words that I needed to know to get close to expressing what I wanted to say. And, you know, in schools, everything is so grammar focused, you know, and every level's like staged around these different grammar points that you have to learn, you know, milestones that you have to achieve in grammar. And I think, you know, grammar is great, and you need it eventually, but I think it's something that you kind of learn naturally as you get started. And once you have the vocabulary and you start putting it together, but you have those base words, then you start to learn the words that you need to kind of connect them, or the cases that you need to apply to them to make them make sense. But that comes with, you know, speaking to other people and hearing how they say it. And then it comes from actually knowing the vocabulary to know what to do with it, you know. So I agree with you, because before, you know, having learned in school, everything was like, oh, I need to learn this grammar rule, and I need to learn this tense, and I need to learn, you know, the gender of all these words and stuff like that. Yeah. But, you know, I have a French family, and the kids in the French family, they mess up the gender of words all the time.
Yeah.
So it's like, well, if they're doing it, then I guess it's not that big of a deal if I do it. And it's not even kids, you know, I've heard adults use the wrong gender for words as well. So, you know, and, you know, that kind of brings me to the point where, you know, people, they expect to speak their target languages perfectly, and they get frustrated, and then they don't speak, and they don't go out and use it, and they don't do things because it's not perfect, right. And they're embarrassed that it's not perfect. But when you really think about it, I mean, just in our call so far, I've caught myself making mistakes in English a few times. So.
Me too.
And that's my native language. So if I'm going to mess up a language that I've been speaking my entire life, why would I be afraid of making mistakes in a language I've only been learning for a few years? So
yeah, let's explore that, because I think that's an interesting point, because I suffer from the exact same thing. And actually, I've told the story before of how bad it was. It was so bad that once, when I was talking to my tutor, I would have Google Translate open at the same time, so sentences that I was thinking about speaking, I would actually double check them through Google Translate. I know that's not entirely foolproof, but if Google Translate didn't give me any errors, I would not know better. If it said this looks correct grammatically, if it didn't suggest any improvements, I would say it. And of course, there would still be mistakes in it, but it just shows you this sickening perfectionism. Just say the damn thing. Just say the damn thing. And if you don't know the gender, just guess. Just pick any gender. Most of the time, you'll be surprised how correct you are because it's intuitive. And, well, it's not intuitive, but it's in your brain somewhere if you have learned it at some point. So your first impression or your first guess is probably going to be correct most of the time anyway.
Well, that's what we do as native speakers as well when you think about it, because you grow up hearing your parents or whoever speak the language that you speak. And so basically you're modeled kind of after what you hear them saying. Of course, later in school and as you read and as you take on your own interests, you develop your own kind of personalized vocabulary. But I can tell you with French, I used to repeat things that I heard my family say all the time around my friends. And I would get made fun of for them. It was like, I don't know, someone always used to say something in French along the lines of like, oh my, like if you're hungry, you'd say how hungry I am. Or it was, I don't know exactly how to translate it, but there was one time I was out with my friends and they were like, oh yeah, let's go get something to eat now. And so I said this phrase that I had heard so many times in my head. So of course I think it's just a totally normal thing to say because in my family it's a totally normal thing to say. And I said the phrase and my friends just started laughing hysterically. And they're like, listen to how she talks. They're like, say it again, Shannon. And then like, I was just so embarrassed, but that's what you do. You model, what you hear in your native languages based on what you are, hear around you. And so you should do the same thing with your target languages. It's a natural way to learn them. And even if it's not totally correct, it probably will be more correct than if you think about it too scientifically and you don't get it out at all.
Right, and being correct is actually not that important. I think, I used to think probably, but now it's more like, is it going to be understood? And if it is, I'm totally happy. That's the point of communication. The point of communication is not to produce 100% grammatically correct sentences. The point is just to get your inner brain, whatever, thinking translated into human speech. And you do that with your native language automatically. But with your target language, you need to have a lot of practice with it before you get into that sort of automatic phase. And on that path from nothing to perfection, which I guess you can't achieve anyway, but let's say along a lot of the way anyway, you will make a lot of mistakes. And without making mistakes, also sometimes you might not know that you're making mistakes. If you don't have a tutor or something like that, if you don't actually say stuff, they can't really give you feedback on it. So if you just sit in silence instead of trying to say the sentence that you were missing the gender or you forgot the, I don't know, third person conjugation of a verb or something, if you just say the sentence, I'm sure you'll be given feedback. I mean, that's my impression from most of the people I've interacted with in the foreign language. They would be happy to point out if you made a mistake, and if they don't, you've succeeded in successfully communicating.
Oh, I agree. I think that, native speakers will let a lot go too, because as long as they understand you, they don't care about correcting every little error.
Right.
But once again, you're successfully communicating because even if you made an error, they understood you. And that's really all you want anyway. So, I do suffer from the perfectionism syndrome, and I do want to speak the languages that I speak as well as I possibly can. I mean, that's part of why I continue to work for them or work towards, getting better at them. See, there's an English mistake right there. And, so that, wanting that desire to get better, that desire to improve, that's a music thing for me also. I don't ever see myself as having arrived at being good enough in music. I always know that I can be better. Right. And so that, that drives me to continue to work on it and to continue to improve. And it's the same for languages. So I know I'll never be a perfect speaker in my native language or in my target language, but I want to be as good of one as I can be. So, I keep working on it.
Right, and back to the native language thing, I mean, we're not perfect in our native languages. We only have I don't know how many words they say are in the English language now, but most fluent speakers won't know more than 25,000, they say. And if you can't be perfect in your native language, which is the one you've been using all your life, then it's very ambitious to suddenly think that you can do it in a second language. But it's good to work towards it. It's like the carrot at the end of the stick, in a way, where if you keep improving every day, and you can do this with English. If you're an English native speaker, you can learn vocabulary for sure. I mean, if you're in a technical field, if you're in a business environment, I guess even musical environment, I'm sure you could say English words to me right now, and I would not have any idea what they meant. So, I mean, that's what I mean when people say the thing that I want to be perfect, or I want to be perfect. I want to speak perfect French or whatever. And it's just unrealistic and impossible, I guess. And also because the language changes all the time. Some changes are smaller than others, but by the time you got to, let's say you wanted to learn 150,000 English words, which I don't even know if it's possible. I mean, I like to think that the brain can do anything we set it to, but if you did learn 150,000 words after that many years of doing that, there would probably be another 1,000 new words. So the list constantly expands. In other words, but anyway, I totally agree with what you're saying, and I'm glad we can talk about these things, because it's the points that are worth repeating over and over, basically. And even as someone who's interviewed lots of language learners, and I've heard many of these concepts before, having them repeated really works, because of this concept of you can get the right information at the wrong time, and then it won't make any difference to you. But if you keep getting them repeated to you, at some point the brain's going to be like, wait a minute, now I've heard this 5 times, then there must be something to it. I mean, we're very suggestive people. So just having these good concepts repeated is really worth it, I think.
I think too, with issues like perfectionism and things like that, these are internal struggles that we kind of have, and so they're not something that we actively talk about with other people. So when you hear that someone else deals with this too, you don't feel so alone in experiencing that. And I think that's important too, that as language learners that blog and that have podcasts like you and I, it's important for us to talk about our struggles as much as we talk about our successes. Because if we sit there and we just say, hey, look, I passed my Chinese exam after only a year of learning language, and hey, look, I did this, and hey, look, I did that, that's great. But what's more important is the process that got us to that point, and the struggles we had getting to that point, that we share a little bit of that too, because I mean, we're not perfect, and we struggle with things, and I think it's important for people like us in our position, sharing kind of what we're doing, that we talk about those things as well, and that we're transparent in that.
For sure, and that was part of my motivation for starting my blog back in the day, a little over 2 years ago, because every single other language learner would always be talking about the successes, the wins. And it's very natural. If you're doing a blog that's called How to Learn Chinese, of course your blog posts are going to be how I learned this, how I did that, and it's not going to be like how I didn't do that. So it makes complete sense, but I'm happy that we're sort of turning the tide a little bit and showing that, you can be a terrible language learner and still have a lot of fun with it, and you will still learn a language a lot faster than you thought you could, because most people have the wrong idea that they can't even learn a language to begin with, let alone in 6 months, a year, or whatever long time you want to put on it. But the fact is just that you can, with the right mindset, and that's what we want to show, basically present the struggles as much as I actually think the struggles are more fun now than the successes, but obviously, since I am the one struggling, that's not so fun. But at least writing about it makes me, I guess it's a way of processing, and it helps other people. So that's good. But that brings me to an excellent segue. Oh, sorry?
Oh, no, you actually said something that I think is really important. You said that you can still have fun with language even if you're not the best language learner.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And that is so important. I mean, having fun with it is the best thing. So if you're learning a language that's not working for you, you switch languages or maybe you switch techniques or you do something. The important thing is to have fun with it. And you don't have to be the best and you don't have to be the fastest.
Right.
It just needs to be something that's enjoyable for you. And I mean, music's the same thing. I mean, look at how many people perform music and do music and participate in music in some way compared to how many of those people are actually professional musicians who make a living from doing music. Stuff like that. It's not so much about the success and about being the best and about being, a celebrity language learner or musician. It's just about doing something that you really enjoy. And if you enjoy learning languages, you shouldn't be pressured by, being the best. You should just do it because you like doing it.
Right. I totally agree, but the problem is sometimes that there's a bias in the people who are going to write about learning languages. Is usually the people who are quite good at it. That doesn't go for me, but a lot of the blogs before I came along were ridiculously good language learners. I mean, we're talking Luca Lamparello, Richard Simcott, Connor Klein, Jan van der Aar. I mean, these people are very talented people, and I'm sure most of them wouldn't admit to that, but I've met them several times, and they are very talented players in the language learning. And so there's a bit of a bias, or at least there used to be, of where the people reporting all the language learning would be very good, and then if you're reading it and you're thinking, wow, Benny Lewis learned French in 3 months, it's like, why can't I learn French in 3 months? I must be stupid. But there's that bias because he's sort of done that for a while now, and he's at a different point of his language learning. You can't also compare yourself to somebody who's learned 10 languages already and you're learning your first. That's a completely different experience, and you can draw on all the cognates. You can draw on you kind of know what words are important and what's not important, like my kids and hotel numbers and stuff like that. But so that the comparison game is very bad. And actually, Chris Guillebeau, you probably heard of him. He wrote a Facebook update the other day, and I'll be sure to include it in the show notes into this episode. But he wrote basically a Facebook update saying like the curse of comparison or something, and how toxic it is to compare yourself to other people, especially people who are at a very different stage in whatever field. I guess it's the same with musicians. If you compare yourself to someone like, I don't know, who's a top see, this is where my musical interest really shows. Who's a really good musician? Lady Gaga, whatever. She's quite popular, right? It would be quite... you couldn't expect to do the same as she has done after she's been doing it for however many years. I mean, she's a hustler, right? Like many of the top musicians. So she's been hustling for a long time.
Oh, sorry. The comparison game is just a horrible game to play because we're all our own unique people. Right. And, even with something like music or language, even if you're at the same age, the same number of years of experience, the same instrument or the same language or whatever, you can't, it's still not an apples to apples comparison because you're going to use different strategies. You're going to have different interests within the language itself. You're going to have different goals for learning the language, and all of that needs to be taken into consideration. So when you go and you look at someone like Benny Lewis or Luca or Richard Simcott or, any of those learners who are really successful at doing what they do, you can't compare yourself to them. No. And these are also people who have done this for a long time, and it's primarily what they do. And maybe you have a family and a job or school or something else that's going on, and you can't invest the same time into it that they can. So again, you can't compare in that way either.
Yeah, exactly. I totally agree. But getting back to the blogging and writing about it, you have a website, very nice website. Can you just give me the pronunciation, the usual everyday pronunciation?
It's the French way of saying linguist, so it's also linguist, and it's Euro-linguist.
Okay, that's good. I was trying not to get into some weird pitfalls of linguiste or something. It's good. As somebody who's only studied French briefly, then that would be scary. But what made you start blogging and writing about the experience of learning languages and travel?
I started doing it under a completely different name when I was in university, but I mostly wrote about my experience in university and what I was studying and things like that. And language was a part of that. So I occasionally wrote about my experience learning languages. Mm-hmm. And when I graduated, I kind of stopped doing it. But then I started again maybe a year or two later, I think. But it was really all over the place. I literally wrote about everything. Like DIY stuff, and even when you go back into the archives on Eurolinguist.com, which is what it's become with the name change and everything like that, you can see kind of how random I was. I've been trying to clean up the blog a little bit to bring the focus in. So now I mostly write about, basically you could say language and culture, because travel, food, and things like that, it's all kind of culturally related, I suppose. So I write about regional recipes. So I do recipes from different parts of the globe. I also write about my travels, because as a musician and then having family abroad, I get to travel quite a bit. And I often even joke that I do music for the travel. And I also write about my experience learning languages, my successes and my failures. And I share what I've learned, because when I started out doing this whole thing, I had no idea what to do. And so I hope that, in sharing some of what my experience has been, that maybe I can save someone some of that time that they spend not knowing what to do, and that, maybe I can help get them pointed in the right direction a little bit sooner.
Right. Does it give you any is there any therapeutic benefits or a reflection? Like people say it's very good to keep logs of what you do. Do you feel like it helps you sort of view the world or the things that you do?
I believe that when you teach someone else how to do something, it in return makes you better at doing that thing as well. Because when you understand something enough to explain it to someone else, that really shows that, you've started to grasp something as well. I mean, I can't say I'm an expert on anything, because I'm always learning about music, about language, about, just being a good person every single day. So, I don't claim to be an expert, but I just want to share my experience, because one, it can help other people, and two, because it helps me better internalize it myself.
Right. Of course. And, I don't think you need to be an expert either. I mean, there's always going to be people who are at different stages along the journey of multilingualism, or, I don't know, culinary perfection or something. So it doesn't matter that you're not an expert. And I guess this goes out to anyone listening who's thinking about writing about their experiences, traveling, learning languages, or whatever you're doing. You don't have to be the best in the world or even close to it to have interesting opinions or features. I think a lot of the time the interesting points come from people who have gone over the early stages, the early troubles, and are now sort of good in the middle and trying to find out how to become better, how to optimize, how to be more efficient and things like that. So, you could be coached by somebody who, like Richard, who's learned who knows how many languages, he doesn't even know. Whereas you could coach someone who's only starting learning their first language, or who's learned a couple of languages but are getting stuck. So there's always like this path, right, that you don't need to be an expert for sure. I agree.
Definitely. I mean, you only have to be at a slightly different stage than the person who your audience is, I suppose. So
exactly, and it's just motivation anyway. I mean, even if I'm reading articles about the struggles that I had ages ago, it's still motivating for me to read about how other people are coping with them.
Yeah, it's a fresh perspective. That's definitely true.
Exactly, ideas worth sharing. Basically, it's always useful. And one thing that we skipped over a little bit, I guess, but we'll get back into it, is you talked a little bit about your learner profile earlier, that it's the introverted learner profile, which I also am, and that brings about its struggles, particularly when a lot of the advice today is about, oh, just go out and speak to people and learn a few phrases, And I'm like, I've been to this subway right next to my house here in Budapest about 1,000,000 times, and I've ordered in Hungarian about 200 times. So I know every single word and I know how to say it. But sometimes when I go down there and I try to order, I'm just like, and I come out and change to English. So it's definitely a real thing, this identity of introverted versus extroverted.
Yeah, I do the same thing. Like, I'll mentally prepare myself to go practice, or there's going to be a train in a moment. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I mentally prepare myself to go out and speak and use this language that I've been studying, and then I'll say something, the person might not understand me, or I won't even get to the point where I say something because the situation was a little bit different than what I had anticipated. And I'm like, nope, forget it. Okay, I'm just reverting right back to English, or to French, or wherever I happen to be when I'm trying to do this. And so I'm totally there with you. And it even took me forever to work up the courage to even get to that point. So,
yeah, me too.
Yeah, because a couple years ago, I couldn't even imagine speaking to strangers. But I had because this is something I kind of had to work through music as well, because I can't be up on stage looking like a terrified little girl when I'm supposed to be entertaining people. And it was something that I really had to work on with music. So that was something, another thing that I was able to take from music and apply to language learning, because if I could do it for music, why can't I do it for language learning? And I actually had a music coach a few years back who, told me every single day I had to go talk to a stranger.
Oh,
and
wow.
it didn't have to be a big, long conversation. Like, I just had to do something little, like maybe compliment them on the shirt that they were wearing or the watch that they had on. And if it turned into a conversation, then that was fine. But if all it was me giving this person a compliment and them saying thank you, that was fine too. But the point was just to get used to talking to people that I didn't know.
Right.
And that actually wasn't that long ago. So it was around when I was interested in languages as well. So I was able to kind of apply the same thing to language. I can actually tell you about a specific time that I did it. I was out with my mom shopping for clothes, and there was a group in the changing room next to us of a mother and two daughters who were about my age. And the mother was trying on different clothes, and they were speaking Chinese. And I was probably standing there for a good 10, 15 minutes before I finally worked up the courage to say something. But I did. So the mother came out in one dress, and I told her in Chinese that I thought that dress was pretty. And I'm actually really good friends with one of those girls now. So you just never know what's going to happen. And if you have the courage to just kind of step outside your comfort zone as an introvert or as someone who is shy, you'll be surprised, I think.
Yeah, and it's funny. This reminds me totally of what happened just last week for me. I was at a party, or actually not a party. Well, it was a party or two, I guess you can say. We were just having a beer at the local pub, and next to me there was definitely two guys speaking Russian. Like, I was 100% sure, and I was like, I'm really trying to learn Russian, so if I don't go over and speak to them, I would ruin the chance. I mean, it's not every day I hear Russian around here. It's not like it's completely uncommon, but it's not often that I'm in a setting where, you can just casually walk over and talk to people, and it's in a bar, so people are always cheery, and you just say cheers or something. That's a good icebreaker. And so it took me also a good 15 minutes or something, and probably another beer, to just, work out the courage to go home and say, excuse me. And then I said just cheers in Russian. And my friend who was there, he's actually Danish Russian, so he speaks it also. And then we had a nice little conversation, and I realized how terrible my Russian was. But that's not really the point. It's not about how you perform after you went over and talked to people. It's more that you actually did it, and you did say something in Russian, and they said, wow, you speak really good Russian. I didn't understand half of what they were saying, but my sentences apparently came out somewhat. But it was terrifying, of course. But once I'd done it, I felt on top of the world. So it's not to be underestimated for sure.
Exactly. And that's a perfect example. And I think actually, kind of to use you as an example, sorry, Chris,
Right.
you said that, and actually for me too, because now that I realize what I said earlier, we both took a minute to kind of gear ourselves up to make that first approach. You know what I mean? So you needed your extra beer. I needed another 10 minutes just standing there. But, as an introvert, that's something that you have to do because for us, social interaction can be really draining.
Yeah.
And so we need to prepare to go into it, to kind of save up energy and then also when afterwards, we need some time to ourselves as well, because that's how we recharge. And that's something that's important to think about. So it's, even though the advice is geared towards introverts and it's like, hey, go out and speak, go out and speak, go out and speak, go out and speak, talk to strangers, talk to the waiter at the restaurant. If you hear someone speaking your target language on the street, go and talk to them.
Yeah.
That's great. But as an introvert, you just need to make sure you take that extra step. So,
yeah, just take a breath and think about it. Do you run over the first sentence in your head?
Totally. I plan out the whole conversation in my head and it never ends up that way, but it helps me because it's in a way it's visualization.
Right.
And so, I also, as someone who's shy and worried about making mistakes, it gives me that little extra practice in my head. I've also had, situations where I've done that and it's still come out totally wrong.
Or you just get nervous and when you're saying it and the pronunciation completely cracks and people are like, what are you saying? Speak English, man.
But at the same time, okay, so like let's say you approach someone and you totally botch it. You just mess it up and you say the wrong thing. Sometimes, that's a good thing too, because maybe they'll think it's funny and they'll correct you and they'll help you, or maybe it's what propels you into a conversation with this person. So
and I think we should also be, one thing that I've learned perhaps in the last few years is that we should not be we shouldn't be afraid to make fun of ourselves either. So if we make a mistake and it's a really funny mistake, after you're done talking to the person, laugh about it, have a little, because it's funny. It's funny when you make that mistake, but it doesn't mean that you've completely failed as a language learner or that you can never speak to Russian people again. It's funny to just be like, that guy did not understand a word I was saying, and just have a little laugh about it. That's what I think, because sometimes we can take ourselves a little bit too seriously, and I realized that, why do I pretend to be good at Russian if I'm really terrible? It's better to just assume I'm terrible, and then if I actually say something nice, I'm going to actually be in a much better mental state than if I expected to be perfect, and then obviously wasn't, and then be totally let down about the experience.
Yeah, no, we definitely can't take ourselves seriously, especially in something that you're learning. You're going to make mistakes, so it's better to laugh at them. Sometimes it's really hard in the moment.
Right.
We have our embarrassments and we're like, oh my gosh, what just came out of my mouth? Like,
some languages have traps for sure.
Or, false friends sometimes will really get you, I have to say. It happens to me in French. My husband and I actually have a page on my website called the Euro Dictionary, which are ridiculous things that have come out of our mouths because we speak two languages so regularly, like where we mash words together. My favorite was one that he actually did. It was the word crumpy. He was trying to say grumpy, but he was convinced that the word grumpy was crumpy. So, it's just little things like that. And it's like, and when it happens, you're embarrassed and your face turns bright red and you're like, oh my God, how can I go on with this conversation or my life? Or how can I ever speak to another Chinese or Russian or whatever person again? And you're like, I'm never doing this again. I'm so embarrassed. Right. But instead of using that embarrassment as a reason not to do that again, use that embarrassment as something to, take the steps you need to be better the next time.
Right.
Yeah. So
perfect. And I know another segue coming up. I know that you've been working on a little secret project about especially introverted language learning, shy language learning. So can you tell us a little bit about what this project is about and how you've been working on it?
Yeah. I have a book and an e-course that is going to be released at the end of the month. That's April 2016 for people who are listening in the future.
Nice one.
And the book is called Say Goodbye to Shy, Speaking a Language the Introvert's Way. And the reason that both shy and introvert are in the title, even though they're not necessarily the same thing, is because the book really covers how to learn a language if you're either shy or an introvert.
Right.
Because you can actually be an extrovert and be shy, which means that as a shy extrovert, it's hard for you to initiate a conversation, but once you are a part of it, you really thrive on the energy of, being a part of that interaction. Whereas being a shy introvert is someone who both has a hard time initiating the conversation, and then having it itself, is kind of takes away energy. And then there's also outgoing introverts who, enjoy talking to people, but they still find social interaction draining.
Right.
And the book kind of touches on each of those three. So outgoing extroverts, I'm sorry, but you can't create things for everyone.
Extroverts, yeah, there you go. I mean, I guess for them, the old advice of go and talk to people is very much accurate.
Yeah. So the book basically just covers how to use your strengths as an introvert or as someone who is shy to succeed at language learning, and it's actually both a book and an e-course. So
you can go through it at your own pace and study each chapter, each section.
Exactly, and you can digest it the way that's most comfortable for you. So if you prefer watching video, you can watch the video e-course, and if you prefer reading, you can read the book, or if you kind of like a little bit of both, there's that option as well. So
cool. So if people are interested in that, they can go to actualfluency.com/introvert, where we'll keep a little page of all the information just to make sure that's always updated with the best offer. And of course, I'll chip in with anything I can think of would provide you with some extra value. Since I am an introvert myself, maybe I should just include a little of my own experiences. That could probably be fun. But anyway, actualfluency.com/introvert. You can find that book and that course. And I think that was about it. So I'm really happy that we found a common time that worked, and I've been really enjoying this conversation. And
yeah, me too. It's a pleasure talking to you.
I don't know if there's a language learning personality type, but I definitely energize from these talking about language learning methods and concepts, and I don't know how that works, but it definitely helps me to energize and stay motivated for learning my languages, which my learning has been a little bit dubious lately, so that's always useful to get back on track. So I just wanted to thank you for coming on and taking the time to share your experiences and tips and tricks with the Actual Fluency audience. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me on. It's such a pleasure to, get to actually speak to the Chris Broholm and be on the Actual Fluency podcast. I mean, I was like,
you're way too kind. You're way too.
It's one of the high points for me so far, Chris.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Actual Fluency podcast. If you want to come onto the podcast and share your language learning story, don't hesitate to apply on actualfluency.com/guest. See you in the next one.